Now, compare that to the generation of young Malaysians today who are reaching political maturity, who are now exposed to news, internet information on a scale that their parents and grandparents were never exposed to. I'm struck by how, despite the youth of the younger generation of Malaysians, in terms of their perspectives and the way they view the world, they are actually much older. They are older because they are born into a Malaysia at the age of cynicism, where grand narratives and grand slogans don't work anymore, fail to convince. So in a sense, we talk about the generation gap between the older and the younger. It goes both ways. You have an older generation physically, but who are young in their ambition and their faith in politics. And then you have a younger generation who are younger physically, but who are older in their political cynicism. You can even call it a sort of ideological agnosticism. Because what have they seen over the last 20 years? They've seen unequal development. They've seen the rise of state control of the media, of education. They experience this themselves in the universities. The cutbacks that Professor Khoo was talking about, the diminishing in value of certain disciplines which 20, 30 years ago were deemed crucial to the state, today now being compromised for the sake of the market, free market politics, or even profit in the cases of some institutions. And so this disconnect is something which I find very, very difficult to bridge, because there's no median point. There's no point of contact between the two. My concern for Malaysia is not unique to Malaysia. My concern is basically directed towards Southeast Asia as a whole, because I see the same problem appearing, manifesting itself in different forms across Southeast Asia, which is the problem of nation states that emerged in the 40s and 50s at the time of hope and has developed enough to create this intelligent, dynamic, younger generation who, ironically, are now coming into the world at the time of deep cynicism, fear, anxiety about not only their personal economic futures, their economic well-being, their political well-being, but the well-being and the economic future of the world as a whole. This next year might see Malaysia going through what may well be one of the worst economic crises that we've had to face. And it's not even our own doing. It's not even our own doing. For once, we can say we're innocent. Yeah? We did not create this mess. This mess landed on our doorstep. And it is precisely in the face of this crisis that nations are tested. Here's where my cynicism arises, and it stems from the points that Professor Khoo has mentioned. Like Professor Khoo, I'm deeply worried about the sectarian nature of politics in Malaysia. For these divisions were not invented by the British, I agree. And furthermore, have been reinstituted and now re-manifest itself in the form of the, I believe, divisive sectarian politics that we have in Malaysia today, which is reflected everywhere, in our social spaces, even in the canteens of our universities, where you see communities not even talking to each other anymore. In the face of such a crisis, a real crisis that will impact upon the pockets of every Malaysian family, and without that glue, that very subjective glue that somehow binds the nation together, that my most pessimistic prognosis would be a sort of Hobbesian state of nature, where it's every man for himself, which would be, I think, hardly a fitting epitaph for a country that began with such promise half a century ago. And this is where, again, that political will is required. What Malaysia needs, I believe, at this stage, is a political culture that reflects and accepts the complexity and the plurality of Malaysian society, as been noted by Professor Khoo earlier, but one which, on the one hand, accepts this plurality and complexity, but does not perpetuate and deepen it, but rather hopes to actually bring it back together again. Nation building, I fear, in the context of Malaysia, this is true for the rest of Southeast Asia as well, has not succeeded simply because it has been hijacked by other ethno-nationalist demands. And as long as this remains the norm, as the defining feature of Malaysia's political landscape, as long as we continue to maintain and reproduce this sort of divisive sectarian politics in this country, whether it's divided on the basis of ethnicity or language or religion, then the question remains, have we arrived at Malaysia yet? Nation building, as we know, is an ongoing process, and history, I think Professor Khoo will agree, history is a text that doesn't have a full stop. It continues, and we are living in history now. We can only correctly estimate the worth and the historical merit of what we do today with the benefit of hindsight. Unfortunately, all the decisions we make today will not bear fruit until much later, when the results are known and irreversible. In the same way that the first generation of Malaysians could not have anticipated that we today would be discussing this 50 years from now. So I sort of end on a pessimistic note, but what I would yearn for, I suppose, is still a belief in the Malaysian project that was once there. It's sad, I believe, to see our universities fail our younger generation. One cannot compel someone to love a country. No government can legislate a law to make you love your country. And certainly no government can compel you to believe in your country. But that is about the only thing we have left that glues this, subjective, variable, artificial construct that we call Malaysia. Ironically, we can budget and we can factor in all the material, political statistics and figures that we like. This variable X may well prove to be the thing that determines whether Malaysia goes through this crisis intact or in pieces afterwards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Farish, for his insights. So far we've heard amazing, penetrating observations from two very brilliant scholars. Professor Khoo lamented the loss of history, and with that the loss of any sense of real culture and national identity in Malaysia. And Dr. Farish built on that observation by detailing all the radical changes that have taken place in Malaysia and the region as well, outlining the points of potential and hope, but at the same time the points of concern, right? So we've seen the rise in education, the rise in wealth, but also a rise in cynicism in new generation. So how do we make the most out of that situation? How do we transform that towards the better? So as I said earlier in the beginning of the program, we were going to allow each of our speakers here to speak for 20 minutes. Now we're going to move to the response session, where I will give you each 10 minutes to add on to whatever that was said by those who have a bit of dialogue here. And after that, we will open the floor to questions and answers. So I'll pass the mic to Professor Khoo to respond to Dr. Farish's observations.
I'm afraid I agree with Dr. Farish. There's nothing for me to ask. If he has questions for me, I'll be too happy to answer. But above all, I want questions from you. In Malaysia, usually after you speak to a large number of people, you ask them, do you have questions? So actually, I think I agree with you.
Then can I probe you, Prof, to perhaps recount to us? I'm not a historian. I'm a philosopher by training and a political theorist. What interests me is the politics of history. So I approach history writing as a discipline, and I'm focusing more on the politics of the writing of history. You've been a historian, and so you are embedded in the structures of the production of historical knowledge. And so you've been through this entire process and watched how, from the early stages, Malaysian history was written, and you've given us an account of how, in the course of the decades following the creation of Malaysia, the value of history as a discourse, as a discipline, has diminished and been superseded by other knowledges, other disciplines. But could you perhaps for the benefit of many of the younger scholars here who may or may not be in the discipline of history, can you perhaps give us an account of how this actually happened? Because like I said earlier, we didn't have a cultural revolution. There was never a sort of Maoist revolution here where they just burnt all the history books. We've seen this in Indonesia, where during the rise of Suharto, all the history books of Sukarno's period were either burnt or erased or destroyed and rewritten again. But in Malaysia, what we've had is basically an impoverishing of history, a sort of shrinking of history. How did this happen? Who were the ones responsible? How did this process actually take place step by step, institutionally?